those services that take care of those crises when they occur. So I want to start pushing harder on that piece. That is something that I believe that your municipality will be very helpful in doing when it comes to the meetings with the politicians and the letters that will need to be written. And on the federal side, who knows what's going to happen in DC, but there is some rumor that they may reintroduce earmarks into this Congress. If that were to happen, we want to get in line for that kind of thing. So those are that's the broad outline. I don't foresee a will or a desire on the part of this board or our residents or any of you all to drop $3 to $4 million of bonds onto the tax rolls for facilities. But if there are $3 to $5 million worth of grants that can become by over time, I'm also not opposed to the idea of, if anyone has ideas about a creative way to finance that somehow, and I don't even know what that would mean, but outside of the traditional grant or borrow choices, I think that needs to be done. Now we know that Burdett got a lot of USDA money for their fire hall, so there is money floating around in the system, but finding it and accessing it is never that easy. So that's kind of the broad brush of what I see as far as fire. And I'll pause there before going on to EMS if there's any comments or thoughts. Or
you have an idea on the timeline for that? Are you looking at 5 years?
It could be a year, it could be 10. I mean, it's just, I don't even know, because the state, New York State, as you know, does a very good job of overfunding grant and zero interest loans for water and sewer, anything that they consider, which in the case of water and sewer, they consider essential. They do a terrible job, in my opinion, of doing any type of funding for fire, police, or ambulance. Fire being mandated, I would think that would be something that you'll be willing to do, but I don't know. Whether we did have a conversation with Senator Romero about it, and he said that yes, they know they don't do a very good job of funding that, and no, he doesn't know what they'll ever do to fix it. So, yeah.
One comment on fire. I still think fire is, public safety is my second largest budget for the town of Hector. Mm-hmm. Highways first, and then public safety. Highway gets what we call CHIPS funding. Right. Okay, it'd be great to see a similar program that push. I've talked to Senator there of pushing a CHIP funding like program for public safety for fire trucks. I mean, when you're talking fire trucks, the expense, what Odessa just put on there is like $375,000, or they just wanted it to buy. I mean, that's the price of just one pumper.
Right.
You know, that type of money, you would think that maybe the state would begin to help the same way they help with the road, infrastructure. Because for us to keep protecting it, it's getting so darn expensive that, I'm just throwing that out there.
Sure.
It'd just be great if the state could begin to step up to that a little bit. I agree with you. They never had much in the past, in that area, but the expense now is getting so large for any community that they may have to look at another way of doing the funding structure.
I think the problem is, and I mentioned this in our State of the Village meeting, I think the problem, at least at the state level, is that they would just as soon see all of the small municipalities go away.
I agree.
So with that in mind, I don't know that they will have, especially given how the legislature is dominated by downstate. I don't know that there's going to be the will to create that kind of funding.
But you look at it, and does it make any difference if I'm there or if the county was there? You're still going to have fire safety, and you're going to have firehouses, and you're going to have trucks to man them. You can't be running that from one central. That's what we got away from 100 years ago, and they dispersed the fire companies out there so they'd be close to where they, and to run them, you're going to have fire trucks.
Right.
And stuff. So
right.
That's, so no matter whether, and I agree with you, the state would love to see us gone too, and just run from county governments, but either way, you're still going to need that infrastructure, and somebody's going to have to pay for it, whether it's through the county, however.
I mean, even though we have all of the equipment and everything, how about the volunteers? How is that going? and recruitment.
I'll let Jason speak to it. I mean, he mentioned at the State of the Village meeting that our volunteer numbers on the fire side remain strong, which is a good thing.
There's about 30 active. I know we're getting 2 more next month. We're better off than a lot of the departments around us, which the question was raised at the State of the Village. Why do you think so? And I think it's because of our call volume. I think the smaller departments that don't get a lot of calls, I hate to say it, people lose interest and they walk away. We're just lucky. I think we have a big enough area to draw from, and we're just lucky.
So what happens to like Interlaken and places like that? That sometimes the volunteer status, is dropping. Is there anything such as a consortium for volunteer fire companies or sharing?
Maybe you don't centralize firefighting then. That's
well, I do know for Interlaken, for example, if it's anything in the town of Coburg, it doesn't happen all the time, but if it's in the town of Coburg, we go automatically mutual aid with it. So to make sure.
County does it that way. They call at the south end. They call
right. So I mean,
every time.
it's based out of the way Interlaken's done it for us. It's town of Coburg.
Right.
But over there, it's Interlaken, Lodi, and usually Interlaken, Lodi, Ovid, usually all the time.
Yeah, they call every time because they just don't have a home, especially during the day.
Yeah.
During the day, fire is a big mess. So it's like they just call everybody every time.
So you think it's just volume so that they get the experience, Jason?
I think it's the calls. I think like I said, we got a large majority of people to pull from. Some of it I'm only speaking on behalf of myself. Some of it could be the training. Some of it could be the people doing your training. Our training program is done by state fire instructors within the fire department. So if they make it interesting, they make it fun. I don't really have a good answer, but that's just talking.
Well, no, I think that is a good answer. And, I'm just saying that if there are other areas, villages or towns that might need some expertise in that, you can share that maybe with others.
There's a New York statewide recruitment going on in April. I think it's the end of April. It's like Recruit New York. It's like a weekend thing for the whole New York State. What a lot of people don't realize is that you need to have equipment to outfit those people. If you get 20 in the door that day or 10, you need to make sure you have the equipment to outfit them, or else they're not going to be good to you. So that's the part of the New York thing that they don't understand, but we try to do what we can.
Can I just interject that this is a topic that was at TCOT, the Council of Governments, because we're in, thanks to the village, we're in much better shape here in Trumansburg than Slaterville and parts of Dryden and Groton. So there's a very good study that shows some of the effects on smaller, less populated rural areas. It's pretty dire. It's just for Tompkins County, but you could see it's the same picture probably that you would see in any other county. So, there was some discussion about shared service, shared fire and EMS, but then, we're kind of used to paying for it, even though it does cost a lot. When you start talking to people in Caroline and some of those other areas, they haven't been paying very much, so they haven't paid EMS, especially. It was going to cost them a lot. So that sort of stopped the forward motion was when they looked at the cost of that whole thing. So anyway, it's a study that's available, and it might be interesting for anyone to look at.
I think one of the problems, and it starts to segue into EMS, one of the problems that they have found and will continue to find is that unlike the health consortium, where there's no startup capital cost, if they, and I had a conversation with Jason Molino about this, they look at how we have things structured. And although it is a big price tag, and we can have mostly friendly arguments at times about how the money is spent, the county is looking at us as a model for how other municipalities or groups of municipalities can operate. But in order to get started, you're looking at potentially millions of dollars of capital outlay. So where does that money come from? The county, last I heard, the county is certainly not willing to foot that bill. They certainly don't want to run it from the county level, even though Albany would like them to run it from the county level. So I don't know that we're going to see much change of any kind in the next decade, maybe in our collective lifetimes. Who knows? It's just kind of, it is very much status quo. Now, if volunteer departments really do start to disappear, if there are no volunteers, then somebody somewhere is going to have to cough up money to figure out how to pay firefighters. That's the only other option. Given that fire protection is mandated, they would have to figure it out. We're in a fortunate situation with EMS that it already exists, the structure. I don't know how some of these other areas are going to handle it if their volunteer ambulance companies go away. I mean, we can pick up a certain amount of it, and that'll be something that we as a group, even though I do say I always hammer on saying it's a village department, but we will have to decide as a group, how are we prepared to step into the breach if necessary, if we end up covering portions of the next county over, larger portion of the next county over. Those are the things we do have to think about. And I don't pretend to have all the answers to that if and when it happens. But at least back to fire, I think that we're in good shape. The volunteers continue to volunteer. I think the 80-20 rule is always going to be in effect in any organization on earth. You're going to have 20% of the volunteers doing most of the work, and you're never going to change that as long as you build a bench so that as the active volunteers age out or retire, you have new blood coming in on the active side. Then I think we'll be fine. Issues to do with replacement cycles and the trucks and whatnot, we'll have to look at that. How can we stretch the dollar a little bit more? And then facilities, we need help. There's an irony here, and I don't get out into the weeds on this, but although I realize he's probably one of the least favorite politicians in the room, Tom Reed, being a member now of senior leadership in the House, is someone that I think we should start to lean on and look to for help. If there is money available, if there are appropriations, there's a lot of ifs in this sense, but he would have access to at least the knowledge of where we might go and look for grant opportunities for facilities. And I think, and I don't know the guy, but I think the fact that he was a small town mayor briefly might help with what I'm hoping is a persuasive argument of, we're here and there's no one to fill the gap if we weren't. So, can the feds help? Because I don't think that there's a lot of help to be had from Albany.
Gord, when you were referring to facilities before, and I'm sure it's probably still an issue when you're talking about EMS. So I know there have been many different versions and plans and thinking. Maybe pull us in where you are or where you think you're going.
So I think it depends a lot on what glimmers of hope for help we find. We have engineering plans for the renovate and Band-Aid version, and I don't even really mean that negatively. It is retrofitting what is a 1940s era gas station. That is what the fire hall is. So, if someone offers us $1.5 million with no strings attached, then I think we would take that option. If someone, as I said at the State of the Village, the irony of grant applications is it's almost easier to get more money for something new and less money to retrofit something. If someone offered us 4.5 with no strings attached, but you have to go find a piece of land to put it on, I would work really hard to find a piece of land to put it on. So that's kind of a non-answer, but I think the answer is whatever we can find that will allow us to modernize the fire hall and or build something that is new and modern. I'm open to either of those avenues. I'm not married to the idea that it has to be on the current footprint or that it has to be on the new footprint. I'm not married to the idea that we have to separate the departments, and I'm not married to the idea that we have to keep them housed together. It really is going to be a what can we do versus more so than what I like to do.
You just said about Tom Reed, you know, asking him to see what direction or where we could get funding. Is that in the works, or do we all need to step up and do that? Or whether, you know, I don't want to just talk about it. I mean, if you want us to reach out and do something about that.
Define in the works. I've had conversations with his office.
Okay.
I'm in a strange position because I also have interactions with his office from, right?
Yeah, good.
I have interactions with his office through my day job. So I have to be careful how much I cross those streams, but I'm willing to cross the streams if it gets the village some help. So the conversations have been broached, but not pushed very hard yet, because no real reason in particular, a sense of timing, I guess. And heck, the government was shut down for a month, so you're not going to get any calls returned.
Careful about you doing that.
Friday.
Well, that's true too. So.
All right, I just wondered if you needed us to jump in at any time and help out.
Yes, but I don't know that it's today just yet. Having Senator O'Mara in the fire hall was helpful, so that he could see, and
Yes.
he understands. And I think he feels like his hands are fairly tied. Albany doesn't have too much flexibility for the big ticket projects. You know, when we're talking $100,000, he might be able to find it. If you're talking $4 million, he's not going to change. And I just picked that number out of thin air. I figure, go big or go home.
Right.
We tried to give Reed a tour that day he was here, but he was just in such a hurry to get to that place and make a chance.
More about fire, because it sounds like there's a lot going on.
Yeah, so EMS, the facility issue is the same. Albany will, my expectation, and I don't want to jinx anything, my expectation is that Albany would be even less sympathetic to the EMS problem, the facility problem than fire, because fire is mandated, ambulance isn't. I think that, again, the federal route could maybe work if we get lucky with a sympathetic ear. But again, the facility issue is not on hold. I'm just investigating a completely different avenue for potential funding. And if, you know, hey, it won't take long. It won't take but a year to find out that all doors are closed and there's no help to be had anywhere. But if there's a glimmer, if there's a, well, try this, if there's a, well, call this person, then I'm going to investigate that. And Jason Molino actually did send me the number of someone who's had quite a bit of success with grant writing from non-governmental agencies providing grant funding to municipalities for emergency services. So that's, again, another thread to pull on.
People know Jason Molino, the Tompkins County.
Sorry, yes.
He replaced Joe Mariana.
Oh, okay.
He's a new Tompkins County administrator and a village resident. So he's very, and he comes out of the world of small municipalities. So he's very familiar with the funding difficulties that small municipalities have.
What's his last name?
Molino.
Jason.
Operationally, and Ben, jump in anytime. Operationally, we have had very little success, actually no success at all, in finding the type of EMS administrator that we had hoped to find. We had one lead who I couldn't talk into applying for the job, who would have been perfect. She's in the latter stages of her career as an RN and does some assistant professorship teaching type things, nurse manager. So she would have had what we needed, but there was no talking her into it.
Who's picking up? How's that functioning?
We have in-house created what I'm loosely referring to as an EMS executive committee. What happened, or the evolution of it, when we found no applications or no applications that we fell in love with, was I started to look at how the consortium is run. And not in terms of the participating municipalities, but in terms of how the authority is delegated. And so there is an executive director, but it's a very loose position until we're creating a more formal position. So we created this EMS management committee. We meet monthly. We've delegated certain amounts of the day-to-day operations that would have been delegated by a manager to employees. We've delegated them directly to the employees. And out of that is come to light a lot of the things that only the EMS manager would have known in terms of things that we would like to see done better, including internal policies and rewriting some of those. So that's a work in progress in terms of how the department day-to-day policy and working operations might be redone.
So is there like a supervisor or a shift leader or something?
Historically, whoever the paramedic on shift is technically in charge.
So that's one of the things that we're reviewing as far as personnel policies, is if we can do something like the sheriff's office in Thomas County does. They have a manager, there's 2 people, person designated as the lead. So something like that. I think one of the advantages is that we've never had direct supervision in the department. So it hasn't been, I think it sounds like there's a terrible void. I don't think that has been maybe quite as much as it sounds, but it's.
One of the shortcomings that came to light, at least for me, not being aware of it, is, when you have an EMS manager who's also a working paramedic, and then they work their 3 12-hour shifts, they're either generating a lot of overtime to be there at any time at different parts of the week, or they're not there at different parts of the week. So you end up with a void in that supervisory management role anyway, under that particular model. So there hasn't been, at least from a million miles away looking in, there hasn't been a tremendous change in operationally how a shift is run. What is different and what we are feeling our way through is, in the past, if an employee had an issue, they knew definitively who to go to. Now that has been, and it's a little bit better now, but initially that was a little bit nebulous while we were still looking to hire someone for this role. There was a sense of, well, in the meantime, who do we go to if? That's clarified a little bit over the last several weeks. I think those communication channels are a little bit better defined. And then with some of the issues we want to address with respect to shift structure and overtime and those kinds of things, I think it'll be addressed even better once this committee has kind of worked its way through the details of how to structure that. Ben mentions the sheriff's department. There is at any given time 4 deputies on, and whoever the senior sergeant is in charge at that moment. And only if something crazy happens is the undersheriff or the sheriff actually called. So we're looking at some type of a structure where whoever's on shift knows who the senior person is, and they have some level of delegated buck stops here type of decision-making authority. But we've got to think through exactly how that'll be set up. Long-term, I don't know that we will find the type of administrator individual that I had hoped to find. If all of these policy and structural type revisions work, then perhaps the executive committee structure is better. I'm not convinced that that's the case, but it is a question in my mind as a possibility. Maybe, we refer to the consortium because it works so well. Maybe that executive committee decision-making authority who is able to delegate and then meet monthly to handle anything that comes its way. And as long as there's someone who is empowered to make the emergency on-site departmental type decisions, then really everything else can be managed at a committee level. I generally don't like governance or operation by committee, but there's always an exception to every rule. And my experience on the consortium shows that it can work if it's structured just right. So we're still thinking through kind of how that would work. I wasn't going to bring it up, but I guess might as well. Our board has not had this discussion. We were going to talk about it tonight. One possibility that I could foresee is that if that executive committee proves successful, that like the consortium, it could make sense to staff that committee with myself, whichever trustee spends the most time interfacing with the department, and then a board member representative. It would have to be a board member representative. It couldn't be a delegate. A board member representative of the towns to make those kinds, to look at kind of more the operational side of how the department is run. I haven't thought through that all the way because it's still a village department. So are there issues legally? I had a conversation with Guy Crow about it. Are there issues legally with a contractee having access to, for instance, personnel information? I think there probably could be. And yet that is what happens at the consortium level. Consortium directors have access to HIPAA-related information. So maybe it's something about how the MOU is worded. There's some way to structure that so that we don't run into either labor law issues or civil service issues or HIPAA issues. But I think maybe that might end up being the next evolution of the department, which would then feed the conversation of what if pick a municipality, Watkins Glen, needs to contract for services. How do we decide how that's structured? How do we decide what the revenue cost share is so that we're not subsidizing their calls? So again, these are not well-formulated plans. These are just ideas that are being generated by what I'm seeing as the department operates. And certainly open to comments or willingness or lack of willingness, to work in that environment.
So the day-to-day business is carried on by the individual paramedic, such as chart review, peer review.
We have delegated to an individual the scheduling. We have delegated to an individual, there's 3 of them now, the CQI for the charts. We've delegated to an individual to process all of the charts that need to be double checked before sent to MEDEX. Vicky is in charge of when the billing comes back from MEDEX of reconciling that to the standards that the comptroller outlined. And as an aside, we will be approving tonight the differential payback to Ulysses and Covert for what the comptroller found was overcharged in the MEDEX fees, is what that essentially was. And we'll have to have a conversation between now and January about how to recoup what was undercharged in MEDEX fees from Hector. So you'll see that check in a week or so. So the specific department responsibilities for each of those things have been delegated to people.
One individual.
Multiple individuals.
Well, but each one has one particular task.
Correct.
That they're following through with.
Correct. Delegated to those individuals by those who the committee felt was most reliable.
And then they come back and report to the committee. I think that works.
It seems to be working.
It is, it's a little bit dicey though. So things like the paramedic over EMT is sort of established hierarchy on call, like if you're dealing with a medical circumstance or something like that. But if you have like a paramedic who's per diem, and with someone who's been with us full time as an EMT for 10 years, it gets a little bit dicey who directs the in-house stuff. And there's a lot of sort of, there's a lot of friction around the edges of what Gordon just described.
In terms of
other jobs to do.
In terms of rendering service, they're responding to calls.
very well.
It was either Christmas weekend or New Year's weekend, I forget which. We had to back up Bangs for a few hours on a weekend because Bangs was on a second call with Dryden and a first call in Slaterville because Slaterville doesn't have an ambulance anymore.
Wow.
So they were busy. Bangs was busy. So I guess thinking back to 2008, when Bangs was here 3 times a week, it's nice that now we can back them up. But that does show the strain to the system as a whole when there's not enough coverage kind of globally.
So have you spoke directly with Timothy Bangs? Or is there any change in that, or can you speak to him?
I have not spoken to him. My second and third hand impression is that they are also short-staffed.
I just didn't know if the business was going to stay. I mean, Timothy's getting it. I didn't know if he wanted to retire or
No, it's
something.
It's
The
staying.
kids are taking over.
It's
Are they?
staying. I understand there may be a succession plan in place.
Yeah, I think like Megan and Greg and Courtney
Okay.
are all in
I
the
wasn't sure if they were going to do that.
I haven't had any of those conversations with them.
That's good to know.
That's just what I've heard.
But there doesn't seem like there's any danger of them not being around suddenly in a year.
Always good to check.
So, when you were talking about the department's ability now to be able to provide mutual aid, not just benefit from
Yeah.
others. I'm curious about is the new electronic medical record system like fully on board and being implemented?
Such as it is.
Because I'm curious about sort of what kind of data would be in there, or what kind of data somebody's the team are keeping to be able to tell us a little bit more. From the town of Ulysses, we have questions about are there times when our residents are not able to be served by your ambulance because it's way up north or somewhere else altogether? And like, how do will we have, and we be willing and able to provide that kind of information to us on some periodic basis?
I don't actually know whether that would be something that we would track or whether that would be a county dispatch level question. So if there is a call, and I would be curious because I don't know the answer to this.
911's our town.
Yeah,
We've done it before.
if there's a call in Trumansburg's ambulance district or one of your ambulance districts that we cover that we don't respond to and someone else has to be told to go to it, that would be a Seneca, Schuyler, or Tompkins 911 would have that information. I don't know that we are tracking that.
I will say when we were doing Firehouse, they were putting it in as a no response. The things did come. I don't know if they're still doing that in their new reporting or not, but they were doing that.
And I don't know how it would look if,
They dispatch or our EMS?
If the ambulance didn't cover the call and Banks did, they were making a report.
Who's the they, Jason? That's,
Whoever was putting in reports in for at the EMS side.
so it would be
oh,
ours.
EMS, I didn't know whether
They
you were
got
referring
that.
to the 911
That was for
dispatch.
911.
What's that?
They got that information though from 911.
Yeah, but we were doing it ourselves as well. But when they switched to the new program, I don't know if that's being done now.
I don't know how that would look, for instance, if Bangs is out on 3 calls and we're backing them up and then there's a no response or a delayed response. I mean, in theory, what would happen is if we are on standby backup for Bangs and then we got a call, we would leave the standby to go to the call. So it would delay the response. It wouldn't turn it into a no response. The danger when we start talking about a system that's stretched thin is if Bangs is on 3 calls and we're on backup and then go to a first call and then there's a second call in the district. Now there's no one to pick that up. That's an issue. So that would be where, again, at the committee level.
The ones that we know that I've been listening to that we've gone to Ithaca for Banks, they actually didn't calls. They actually are responding to a call for Banks.
Right. So then in that scenario.
So they're actually going on a call.
So then in that scenario, what I'm curious to find out, and haven't had a chance to really fully investigate, is if Trumansburg EMS goes to an actual call, backing up Bangs, who's out on multiple other calls, and then we get a first call in our district, then what happens there? That's a hole that I think at that executive committee level, we do have to start looking at long-term, 10 or 15 years from now, if there isn't any growth in the ambulance services in the area. What if South Seneca Ambulance is either very thin or doesn't exist? What if Schuyler Ambulance is very thin or doesn't exist? Are we going to really need to look at a second ambulance? What kind of costs are we going to be able to recoup from a Bangs if we're providing mutual aid call to them? Probably none if it's mutual aid. Do we have to start revisiting that type of structure? That again brings in Tompkins County into the equation. Do you want people to have ambulance coverage or not? If Trumansburg and Bangs are the only two operate fully staffed and consistently operating ambulance organizations in a 300-mile radius, which is not impossible because we have 110.3 miles in our ambulance district now, square miles, between the village and the three towns. It's not impossible to think that between us and Bangs, well, there's a couple hundred square miles, that could easily grow. Again, there's an end game to that. And it's not pretty if there isn't help somewhere.
Have we ever had a situation where there wasn't coverage in our district because we were on another call and a call came in?
It's always been covered by somebody.
Yeah.
Bangs or somebody.
We have mutual
And
aid
slow
on
in
some
on
regular
regular
basis when we get a second
Yeah,
call
so
or something. But I don't think that I know if we've ever had us committed and Bangs committed.
Yeah, I'm not aware if we've ever been fully committed and had Bangs committed, and we have the second ambulance, which occasionally volunteers can cover in a pinch. Although that would generally not always be BLS service.
We get lucked out a couple of times, somebody that's come in to do something, happened to be at the station, and could go.
I mean, I think not to sugarcoat it, I think it's tenuous. I think the whole concept is tenuous.
And what's really tenuous is we're paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for coverage, and I would hate to be the person who needed it, and we couldn't give it to them.
I personally, I'm going to disagree with Roy, and I think you're going to see it sooner or later that you're going to need two ambulances. That's my only opinion. I think
You have two ambulances. you mean
To staff them.
Staffing,
Yeah.
staffing too.
And we do already do that we have an executed agreement with the school that if they need a dedicated standby ambulance for a sporting event or whatnot, we will pay the second crew and they will reimburse us. So we're actually staffing the second ambulance for certain situations, revenue neutral at this point. But when you start talking about staffing the second ambulance to take calls that may or may not come in, then yeah, it's doubling
It gets a lot expensive.
essentially doubling the bill.
I've been hearing mutual aid calls on the ambulance probably more than, like a few years more than frequently. I know sometimes you'll hear Hector get blown out to Watkins or further away just to back them up, I know we asked for our district to have for the town of Hector, to have the backup be Schuyler ambulance. If Trumansburg couldn't respond, then Schuyler would be the second backup, with Bangs being the third backup.
that actually happened the other night. Tiber was on a call, and Hector came, or Skylar came to County Route 6 or something.
So we tried to get that, at least, we said that was the request of some people like Mecklenburg.
And so I think on the plus side, what works is the even though Albany doesn't give us credit for it, the intermunicipal cooperation between all these agencies to cover each other if everyone's on calls. What we don't have any clarity into is if any of those agencies stop operating, or if the call volume goes up so much that there's not the staffing to cover, even if those agencies continue to exist. So it's yeah.
Oh, go ahead. I just have a question about billing.
Yeah.
I didn't know if MedX sets the standard for how things are broken down as far as payment for the ambulances, as to the criteria, as to certain things that you have to administer, or like oxygen or IVs or whatever. Where does that breakdown start? Is that at MedX? Do they do that?
It's at the town board level.
That isn't.
You are 100% in control of your billing protocols.
Well, I know that we used to do that, but I don't remember any meetings with MedX recently.
They are purely an administrator. So you determine.
You tell them what to charge.
Exactly.
You said that you'd set the rate to the village to say, here's what.
We just upped it last year, didn't we, a little bit? Or
Mileage.
to the mileage, it was raised something.
Yeah.
I kind of go,
Right,
I
sometimes.
play along with
Sometimes.
whatever team we're in, I generally stay pretty close to the way you guys are.
Right.
I think it's more confusing if we did.
Now, as you know, Deb, the reimbursement rates are completely out of our control.
Yes.
So, Medicare, Medicaid, commercial, they'll reimburse whatever they reimburse. The mileage rates is one I think we have some flexibility in. We may look into increasing that again at some point. So I mean, that's an ongoing adjustment that can be made, but it's made by all of us, not by MedX.
I didn't know, maybe I didn't say that right. When we first started this out, we had like a list, I guess it was, something of reference to go by, of fee to start at, and then, but I haven't seen those figures of late. I know that we see them, what we have at our budget meeting, but anything new from MedX?
So that would be from MedX. So I have last year's, February 2018's. What they do is they pull an average, kind of a low end, high end, and average.
Right.
For ALS, BLS, and then mileage. And I have last year's numbers. We were going to pull it again soon, but we have to request that of MedX. They don't send that to us automatically. I will certainly share that with you when we get it. The one thing that the executive committee has only just last meeting mentioned is there's currently no billing policy for, what's the technical term? When there's a call and you respond and the person refuses transport. That's about a third, right? About a third of the calls, something like that. So we're not talking about a call that's called off en route, but you get to the scene, slip and fall, fender bender, whatever, and the person refuses treatment. Bangs charges for that.
Right.
I don't know exactly how that works. Maybe Jason knows. If the person doesn't take treatment, then how do you get their
When I
information?
work for bangs, if you touched them or like if you took a blood pressure or any kind of vital, they got charged.
Right, but how, if they refuse treatment, how do you get their information to bill their insurance company, or does it just go to them?
I don't think that's so long now.
So that's not something that I'm convinced we want to pursue, but I am having some of the EMS employees look into how many calls is it? If it's 100,
It's not a
then
bad idea for where it's the only places you go to.
if it's
But-
Run that ambulance up there.
If it's-
I'd be interested if you're looking at that, which I think is a great idea, to understand as best you can why they were refusing. Because if, the town had a lot of concern when we were the last ones in for the fee policy.
Right.
Our fear was that if people thought they were gonna get socked with a big bill, they might have needed an ambulance but declined it because they were afraid of the payment or the charge. So I don't know, I've been asked, fender bender, do you need to go to the hospital? I say, no, I'm fine. I'd be interested not only in the numbers, but the reasons for refusals.
So I think those would be interesting. My suspicion is that, the ethos in our department is very much, they've moved to paid, but it is very much rooted in a sort of volunteer community support kind of ethos. And a lot of those calls, I think, are going to help people up. I don't want to call it a charity, but it is really going to help people. It's just not billable services the way that we do it now. So it's less people refusing service. I suspect that would be a very small number and more
Right,
going and
the
doing
in-home
things that just
assist.
aren't
Yeah.
medical services.
Do those calls go into these call logs, right?
Into the call
So,
volumes, yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
Just not into the billing.
In effect, we're, we're.
So as we're talking about these, what would help us is if we could get those reports monthly.
right, and actually, to go back to Nancy's question about the PCRs and providing the reports that we have historically provided, that is one of the areas that I mentioned of friction sort of on the outside. So one of our employees who used to be one of the leads on the ePCR program that we switched to no longer works here. We've had a lot of, we're sort of chasing that down still, so I apologize for the delay, but it is.
Yeah, regular report generation, we're not trying to not get you the reports. That is an area that is understaffed.
Not available.
But we do, and we actually have Ben put together for the state of the village, the call volume breakdown versus billable. So you can actually extrapolate if there's 900 total calls and 600 bills go out.
Right.
Well, there's
I'd like
300.
to see by recount by municipality how that falls.
Yeah.
Do you think it's?
I have the total district number. I can share that with you. in a
Yeah.
matter of hours, but I don't, to break it down.
Right.
we'd have
I'd like to
set
see
with
that.
my next meeting.
Yeah, you could
Yeah, sure.
send whatever it is you've already put together, that would be great.
Yeah.
So I get that it's a work in progress, any guesstimate about what will be light at the end of that reporting tunnel?
I mean, our next meeting is the 18th,
20th,
20th. Thank you.
recommend.
Week of the 18th.
We'd at least have a better than guesstimate after that meeting. I mean, hopefully we'll be meeting with the employee who is our current lead for the PCR.
Guidance
So she would have a better
should be
idea.
able to help you.
I'm sorry?
The
No,
guidance
we know how
associated
to,
program
we
should
know
be able to
how,
help
we know how to pull the reports. It's assigning it to someone. That's- I would hope in the next couple of months. And I guess the last budgetary thing I would mention, just, again, the committee has to flesh this out and I'm open to input. We have a lot of overtime. We're paying a lot of overtime. At our current trend, which I'm hoping to flatten out, at our current pace, we will be $100 and something thousand over budget on payroll because of overtime.
120 budget wide.
120.
120,000.
Budget wide, and that's projected out. So if we were to curb it now, it would be.
Hire another person, will that fix some of that, or?
So two points, and I won't belabor this point because I don't want to be that guy, but the village eats that. So in years where we're under, and it's understood that the village keeps it, the village is going to eat some number up to 120,000 of overage this year. One thing we're looking at potentially is restructuring the pay scale somewhat. Would we actually save money hiring another paramedic at a paramedic rate versus paying EMTs overtime? That kind of thing. So that may impact the 2020 calendar year budget when we get to that point, how that staffing change is adjusted to try to reduce the overtime. The sheriff's department comparisons are interesting because this is, fire thankfully works very well with volunteers. Police is a part-time department. EMS now is operating very similarly to full-time emergency service departments that generate headlines because they always have so much overtime. And people run for office because I'm going to curb overtime. And guess what? They can't curb overtime. So unfortunately, from a budget standpoint, that's kind of where this growing ambulance department is. And I'm not going to pretend to be that person who can solve the overtime dilemma, but we're certainly going to try. And I think staffing is part of it. I don't know what happens if we end up needing to staff a second ambulance, because if Bangs is short-staffed and we end up short-staffed and now we increase our amount that we're short-staffed by adding positions, then again, we get back to having a lot of overtime. I guess pick your poison. Is it worse to have that problem, or worse, to not have ambulance coverage, like the folks in Sladeville. I think we probably are.
For ambulance coverage, we need ambulance coverage.
So, I know we could stretch it a little bit longer, but,
Yeah.
we're close to
Yeah.
time here, so I don't know,
We
do you have a question, or does anybody else have questions? Well,
I did have a question.
Yeah.
On the total number of EMS contact, calls for our little town seems like it's like 15% of the whole population of the town and the village combined. Is that normal, or is there any, are there like norms for this, like we're way out of whack? Because it seems like 1 out of 8 people get into an ambulance once a year. Does that make intuitive sense?
I mean, as these guys can tell you, I think a lot of that call volume is a select group of
Right,
people calling
right.
their peers.
So that, now they have to.
That's why we're interested in
Right.
reports.
Right.
We can't do anything about it unless we.
Well, I mean, yeah.
So if
However,
that,
too,
yeah,
however,
And-
too, if you go on a car accident, you have 4 patients, they're counting each one of those as a call.
right.
So
And
if
the
you're in a car
reality is-
accident in County Ulysses, you get 4 sign-offs. I believe they're putting in the EPCR, 1 for each person.
Yeah.
That's gonna generate 4 calls and not 1 call, like I used to give the report, used to be 1 call. But now when each PCR is classified as a call to them.
Not only that, but also some significant portion of the calls, particularly in the summer, are gonna be non-residents. So it's not necessarily a population percentage. And the other piece too is that even if we knew definitively that, out of 560 calls on average between the town and the village, that 200 of them were the same person
Right.
calling 200 times, there's nothing you can do to stop it. They dial 911, the ambulance is gone.
I mean,
And now we can do things around the margins, try to get some education into how much it costs. We could start billing for the no service calls
Yeah,
that
right.
show up and don't transport. But
So I would say if you knew that, and let's say out of the 200 calls, 100 of them came from the same place, and 50 of them said, I don't want service, and we can't bill them. There should be a limit above which you do bill them because they're just a pain.
yeah, I mean, billing policy is certainly up to you, but in terms of removing the costs associated with the response, there isn't a way to do that because we have to respond. We're obligated to respond. See, Mike?
See you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, once they call that number.
Once they call that number, they're on the
That's why, I
hook.
mean,
They call that number and hang up, someone's showing up at the door.
So, I mean, I do think that, and you're hearing the message loud and clear, that the more we understand what those patterns are, when we began to hear about the many calls that you guys were responding to at acute addiction recovery, and when we realized that they were not like threatening calls, we talked with the management and the medical people, and they have changed their protocols to reduce the number of calls. It shows that I think there would be no disagreement in this room about appropriate.
Mhm.
Now, of course, they're gonna go if we have to take their call.
Right.
But we've worked with them to say, only call us when you don't have other options. Now, they use Medicaid taxis to take somebody for a non-emergency kinds of issues, they're doing other things. And I think those calls might even get fewer because I just saw today, and I think sent to you, there's now really going to be a detox center up in the Northeast run by the Alcohol and Drug Council. It has been something that has been needed for, I mean, people have been trying to do this for 40 years.
Sure.
And finally happened. But you,
Well, it is for us.
yeah,
I mean, we've gone up and we've steadied at these 2 numbers.
Yeah. well, yeah, I think that we're seeing this year, I think we're
This year
seeing,
we have,
It's definitely, I mean, it's
yeah, they changed.
trending.
it's trending down, okay, good.
Now, the last thing I'll mention before we break is, and I mentioned this before, and I just haven't, for a whole host of reasons, haven't, is that rain?
That's your game.
Even
It's
better.
the tropical breeze at the corner.
Good thing the feet were getting. I have the outlines for what I'm hoping will be in this. Actually, I could use some input on. I want to restructure the way the EMS contract is broken up. So we have a budget. We can argue about budget, how much we spend, but of that 850,000, we are breaking it up between the village and the towns by call volume. And I believe that that is a less than efficient model because it does not cost the same amount for a slip and fall at the SureSafe as it does for a cardiac arrest in MEC. So there has to be some version, and again, I haven't quite wrapped my head around the math of it, but there has to be some version of a way to split up the budget that takes into account call volume, but also takes into account distance and mileage and those kinds of things, and also takes into account the level of service. Because if it's an ALS call on the other side of Hector that ends up being a transport to Strong Memorial, that has costs that are way higher than something simpler. So the good news is that would probably, good news for Ulysses is that would probably reduce your portion of the total budget. That's really bad news for Hector. I'm not quite sure how to make that equitable.
Next year would be great timing.
No, probably
That's
not.
what I had to do to Trumansburg because of such reduced revenue they got and the
Right.
increase in calls. Really,
It would have to be
their rate
something.
went up
It would
tremendously.
have to be something that's phased in over time. It wouldn't actually. It would be very bad news for Covert as well because the district, ambulance district, is so large. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind that I'm tinkering, and that can be a dangerous thing.
So as you tinker, will you be sharing or you'll tinker and announce?
It'll be a tinker and share, and if the village board wants to expand kind of the scope of the EMS committee to include a board member from the other towns, then you would have to help me tinker. That would be.
We like tinkering.
Okay.
Really something that we can certainly try to.
So one thing just to add about that is to keep in mind for all of us, if we do expand our service area, if we, God forbid, have to start covering all the way to Center or something along those lines. In order to do that, we'll have to build new infrastructure. There's a lot of things that go with that. So how do we build a fee structure that accounts for, what the cost of the expansion would be or the cost of rent? Do we want to subsidize as a current district that expansion, or do we want like Gordon mentioned, the sort of startup costs of EMS? Can we incorporate that into the building structure? That kind of thing is sort of where my mind has been going and thinking about it, but just bear that in mind.
Yeah, part to add to what Ben said, part of that tinkering is, what if municipality X needs to contract? Can we have a model in place where their buy-in covers the additional cost to provide that service without having to share it among those who are already paying to cover their service? And the reality is the call volume model won't do that. The call volume model will have us sharing that cost, especially if municipality X is 40 miles away and has 100 calls a year. We're going to be covering a lot of that expense.
You need a model, something like the water district, if you expand water districts, that they pay the cost, the people who do it, they pay the infrastructure costs, and then they tack on the regular costs. It's interesting. You want to know it up front once you started it, because that would be something that you would build into the creating a district or whatever.
That changes how you think about it a little bit.
Because any increase you go, now you would require the creation of a special use district at the same time, so.
Well, thank you all. I mean, this was sort of an inaugural thing, but it just felt like this is the kind of discussion that we often don't feel like we have the time to do in the budget session, so I appreciate it.
I've got one thing.
Yeah, please.
Off a different topic. Most of you, or all of you, are going to get an invitation to this year's banquet. This year's a big deal because it's my dad's 50th year. That's pretty big for the state of New York to get 50 years. We've involved the state fireside. They are doing something. The mayor's office is doing something. So if you can have at least a representative from each town at least be there,
You know what it
we
is.
appreciate it. If you all want to come, that's great. but we are making this a big deal. It's more about him that night than anything else.
That's nice.
So I ran some numbers, I wanted some numbers. I went back to when we started reporting stuff back in 1998. So the fire department EMS went on 16,000 plus calls in the last 20 years. My father, just in the 20 years that we could come up with, went over 2,500. So it's pretty impressive numbers when I started pulling them all together.
No, he's got a wonderful
What's the date?
record of service.
I can't remember. It's in April. It's all
It's like the third Saturday.
All right, it's
Hold
not
on,
tomorrow
Deb.
then,
Hold on.
so you've got time.
I might have put my calendar.
The
already.
6th,
Yes, that's it.
Oh, is it?
Saturday, April 6th, 6 PM at the Legion.
So I just want to give everybody a heads up.
Yeah.
Great. Good, wonderful. I'm glad you're doing that.
That's gonna be great.
Okay, and there is more food, or take a cookie, or something on your way?
You got your report.
Or you're staying,
I have to get up
refuel for the next round?
Are we pausing, sir?
And,
So
so
where-
we're another meeting?
I
Where-
would,
regular meeting is starting at
No,
seven.
I need a motion to recess.
Oh, yeah.
I'm looking for turn.
Another turn.
Okay, we need a second. Okay, we're all done.
Do you think we need another one between now and the budget meeting?
Didn't you just adjourn?
Our budget meeting is when?
So it's usually beginning September.
We'll probably know more about the executive committee before then. So you may end up being more involved prior to that anyway.
Okay, well, let's see how things unfold. We can always.
Did you pause that yet?
I mean, I don't know that we can always have pizza, but, I don't.
This, we'll recess until 7.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, thanks for coming. Sorry, I didn't have that flowery news for you.
Maybe next
Ben,
time.
Ben, do you have a way to pause the live stream?
There you go.